Good afternoon. We are continuing our journey through the books of the Bible as we review the structure and purpose of these books, especially as we see how they fit into the overall narrative of the Bible. Today we are going to look at the book of Ecclesiastes. This is one of my favorite books because it is so unexpected. Some of the things that are said in this book you would not expect to read in the Bible. They certainly don't sound encouraging. But the conclusion that is reached at the end of the book is a powerful one that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds. Let's think about some general thoughts. The simple fact is this isn't a happy book. You're not going to come away reading the first 11 to 12 and a half chapters of this book thinking, wow, what an uplifting read that was. I'm ready. I'm pumped to go out and be a Christian and serve and worship my God. It's not really that kind of book, but that's okay, especially when we reach the conclusion. This is a book of poetry. It is a book of wisdom literature, and it, like Proverbs and Job's, discusses the retribution principle. These three books are kind of almost a dialogue of the retribution principle. And so I want to provide just some summaries. These are very generalized statements, please be aware, of what these books say about the retribution principle. The book of Proverbs generally teaches that the faithful will be blessed and the sinner will be punished. For the most part, that's what you're going to read in Proverbs. Now, the language may be between the wise and the fool, but we understand that. But then we come to Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes, I think, asks the question, do blessings indicate that someone has been faithful? And does suffering indicate sin? And I think this is an important question because when you look at the book of Job says blessings do not always equal faithfulness and suffering does not always equal sin. And so we have this retribution principle. It seems like it is a guide to life, but then we have to be careful pressing it too hard because it's not always true. And I want to share with you this quote from Hill and Walton in their survey of the Old Testament as they're discussing the book of Ecclesiastes. They say, the position Kohelet comes to is an acceptance of the retribution principle in theory. I like that. But a denial of its ability to predict how one might fare in life or to explain any person's current situation. In this sense, Kohelet is in agreement with the book of Job. Both view the retribution principle as conveying something about God rather than offering guarantees in life. Time and chance are too great a factor in this life. I think that's a very helpful summary of the discussion that Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job are having about the retribution principle. As we continue, we want to think a little bit about the poetic nature of this book. It is Hebrew poetry. It is full of parallelism, which we've already talked about. And it's full of imagery. And the wise man in this book is going to present these lessons and these truths in a number of different ways. We have some reflection in chapter 1 at verse 5. He says the sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. So here is a general truth. What lesson can we learn from this upon reflection? He uses the book of Proverbs. Or he uses Proverbs in this book. Chapter 4 at verse 5. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after wind. Then especially verses 5 and 6. The fool folds his hand and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 handfuls of toil and a striving after wind. We see these proverbs, these short, pithy statements, even these better than statements. We see that in the book he likes to use anecdotes, these little stories here and there. We have an example of one over in chapter 10 at verse 5. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun. Let me tell you this little story here in verse 6. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. And then we see that there is just general instruction. In chapter 5 at verses 1 through 3, he talks about being careful about the vows that we make. Guard your steps, he says, when you go to the house of the God to draw near. To listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know what they are doing is evil. Be not rash with your mouth. And so we need to be careful about the things we say as we approach God's throne. Well, we want to talk about the title, the term Ecclesiastes. That doesn't really hold a lot of meaning for English speakers. We understand that the Hebrew title is Kohelet, and this simply means one who assembles or an assembler. And this idea is latched onto in the Greek and the Latin, which basically the term is ecclesia, for an assembly. And so you can hear the connection between ecclesia and Ecclesiastes. And this is obviously from the Septuagint and then the Latin versions. And so sometimes this role in the text of Ecclesiastes is referred to as the preacher or the teacher. And both of those can be a little misleading. We don't want to think of preacher as maybe what I do on Sunday and get up and preach or lecture, that kind of a thing. And because there's not really a great one-to-one English idea here, many commentaries just retain the Hebrew Kohelet, just to serve as the title or name for this role in the book. Well, who is Kohelet? Who is the author here? And tradition is going to say Solomon. I think as we read this book, we are going to think Solomon. Chapter 1 at verse 1 says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. That Solomon would fit that position. He was known for his wisdom. Tradition says that it was Solomon. And maybe this is some kind of a repentance document. You'll remember that, yes, Solomon was endowed with great wisdom, but then later in life he turned to other gods because of the influence of his numerous wives. And maybe at the end, this is a book that as he is looking back on his life, he realizes the mistakes that he made, and he comes back to God and recognizes the great conclusion of this book. The problem is we're just not told that. We're not told that he had that realization and that level of repentance. There are some other issues with Solomon as an author. In chapter 1 at verse 16, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. So yes, Solomon would fit that picture technically, but let's ask the question, who all ruled in Jerusalem before Solomon? Well, this is just David. And so maybe that's not a great way to lift himself up as this wise man, exemplar. So maybe it is someone a little bit further down the Israelite timeline. There are many references to injustice in this book. And the attitude of the author seems to be, well, I can't do anything about it. Well, if Solomon's the author, he's the king, he could do something about it. And so maybe Solomon is not just the clear-cut favorite for being the author here. There are other suggestions that are often given. Some would say Hezekiah. We know that he was a good king. We know that Hezekiah led some reforms to return the people and the nation back to God. There is a suggestion of Manasseh. I find this suggestion very interesting, not because there's a lot of evidence pointing towards it, but because it would be interesting, because Manasseh is actually a horrible king. Manasseh is blamed by Jeremiah for the ultimate destruction of Judah. But you'll remember at the end of his life, Manasseh repents. Manasseh understands how evil he had been and turns to God. And so we suggested maybe this is a repentance document for Solomon. Well, maybe it's a repentance document for Manasseh. Some have suggested some other ideas that we don't know who the technical author is, but it was someone writing in honor of Solomon. And so we have a Solomonic personality, if you will. I'm not a big fan of that suggestion, nor the next one, that it's based on Solomon's life. There's some kind of fictional biography. Those are two suggestions that you'll read in commentaries. I'm not the biggest fan of those ideas. The idea is that they weren't trying to deceive anybody, but then we wind up thinking that it is Solomon. So they failed in their trying not to deceive. The simple fact is that we might be looking at an editor that has put some of these things together. An editor who has related to us the teachings of this sage. It is generally assumed that the beginning and ends of the book are the work of an editor, usually referred to as the frame narrator. And so this frame narrator is telling us what this wise man has said. So the frame narrator begins and ends the book, but the middle is the teaching of this wise man. The simple fact is we don't know for certain. There are a number of things that would fit Solomon's life, and so that is generally the conclusion that most people come to, but the book does not say without a doubt. It would have been nice had he just said in the beginning, the words of Solomon, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. It certainly seems to be a king somewhere along the line, maybe Solomon, maybe someone else. We simply don't know. So when was the book written? Well, we can't really say if we don't know the author. If it was Solomon, then it's somewhere between 970 and 930. If it's Hezekiah, it's sometime in the 7th century BC. And if it's maybe after the exile, as some scholars like to say because of some of the Persian words that are used in the book, then it could be anywhere from 450 to 200 BC. Simple fact is, again, we do not know. Well, let's talk about the book itself. I think as we've gone through this series, if we can get an overall picture of the book, I think that helps us better understand what's going on. Let's look at it very simply to begin with. We have the prologue in verses 1 through 11 of chapter 1. Then we have the teaching of this wise man in the next 11 chapters, and then we have the epilogue, which brings us to the great conclusion. Now, again, that's a very simple structure, maybe not the most helpful. I really liked this outline, again, from Hill and Walton and their survey of the Old Testament books. And I think this could be helpful, maybe a good preacher's outline here. So we have the introduction, as we've already said, and then in chapters 1, 2, and 3, we have the problem of fulfillment. And the problem is we can't find fulfillment. We see all this repetition, we see all this work to give some kind of meaning to life, and there simply is none. Derek Kidner, in his little book on Ecclesiastes, talks about the treadmill of life. It seems that every day is just the same. Nothing's making any difference, and then I'm going to die. And guess what? My children are going to do the same thing, and their children are going to do the same thing. And so you have this repetition. The sun rises and the sun sets, and then it's going to happen all over again. And the solution here, well, maybe we shouldn't be searching for fulfillment. Eat, drink, work, and live your life is one of the conclusions that he comes to in this book over and over. Well, then we have the problem of frustration. There's so many things that aren't fair in life. We understand that. Frustrations are unavoidable. Well, don't work so hard to avoid them. You're just going to wear yourself out. You can't avoid them, so why bother? Just live your life. And then we have in chapters 8 through 12 a section we'll call the guidelines for life. Here's some things, some tips that you need to understand that may help you as you go through life, and it will help you deal with the inability to find fulfillment. It will help you deal with these frustrations. And then we get the epilogue, the ultimate conclusion to this book. Well, how should we read the book of Ecclesiastes? If we're going to read Ecclesiastes, let me suggest to you that you read it twice. And the first time you read it as if you've never read it before. And as you read it, you are shocked by the conclusions of the author. And you feel the dismay of the wise man as he's talking about not being able to find anything new or any fulfillment in life. Feel that with him. Embrace it. Lean into it. But then you come to the end. Chapter 12, verse 13. I know you've been wondering when I was going to read it. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So then we read the book again with the end in mind. And what we have is a reminder of what is and what isn't important. And as we now go through life, the life experiment that we have in front of us from this wise man, as we go through life, we remember that there is no fulfillment under the sun on this earth. That's the point of this the refrain. Vanities of vanities, all is vanity. There's no fulfillment, there's no meaning to life under the sun if we're only looking within ourselves. But if we look to God, now we can find meaning. Now we can find fulfillment. If we fear God, keep his commandments, and remember that we will be judged on how we conduct this experiment called life. That to me is a powerful conclusion. If we are just looking for joy under the sun and meaning while here on earth, there is nothing that will fulfill us. And so I feel this is maybe some of the background behind what our brother D. Bowman says when he talks about heaven, that if you've missed heaven, you've just missed all there is, because this life is about getting there. And so if we look inward for joy and fulfillment and satisfaction, we're not going to find it. We must be looking toward the end. We must be living life with God at the forefront of our mind. And then we will find fulfillment, but only in Jesus Christ.